Arsinoë II was born into a world carved from war. Her birth, around 316 BC, took place in the volatile aftermath of Alexander the Great's death, a time when his fractured empire was torn into pieces by his former generals, the Diadochi. Among those ambitious warlords was Ptolemy I Soter, her father, who seized control of Egypt and declared himself pharaoh. Ptolemy was a Macedonian by birth and a soldier by instinct. He had marched with Alexander, stood in the heart of Persia, and now wore a crown in the desert sands. He was no ordinary king, and Arsinoë would be no ordinary princess. The palace of Alexandria, rising with Hellenistic grandeur, echoed with the weight of dynasties and the soft whispers of power. Arsinoë was born into marble halls, but her life would be no fairy tale. Her mother, Berenice I, was not the first wife of Ptolemy, but she would eventually bear his political heir, Ptolemy II. From the very beginning, Arsinoë was raised not only in wealth, but in warfare, the warfare of politics, alliances, betrayal, and blood. She was a girl tutored by the finest minds of the Mediterranean. In the court of Alexandria, education was power. She was taught history, philosophy, rhetoric, and, most importantly, how to rule. But nothing could prepare her for the brutal future carved for her by the crown she would one day wear. Her childhood was shaped by the ideology of dynasty, of preserving bloodlines and conquering through marriage. There was no love in the royal unions of her world. There were only negotiations. And from the time she was a girl, Arsinoë knew she would one day be a bride, but a bride to politics, not a man. The Ptolemaic dynasty, rooted in both Greek and Egyptian traditions, began to fuse cultural concepts into a strange hybrid of ideology. To the Egyptians, the pharaoh was divine. To the Greeks, a king was mortal, but absolute. For a princess like Arsinoë, this meant being both goddess and pawn. She was destined for foreign courts, for alliances sealed with her womb. At the age of 15, she was married off to Lysimachus, a man old enough to be her grandfather. Lysimachus was no ordinary noble, he was a king. He ruled Thrace and parts of Asia Minor, a powerful territory in the eastern Mediterranean. To the world, this was a marriage of prestige. To Arsinoë, it was the beginning of imprisonment. Her life in the court of Lysimachus was nothing like Alexandria. Thrace was rugged, colder, and harsher. And Lysimachus, once a warrior, now ruled with caution and fear. But Arsinoë adapted. She gave birth to 3 sons, each one a symbol of her worth to the throne. She played the role of queen, wife, and mother, but she was also calculating. She watched court politics like a scholar watching storms. Lysimachus had older sons from other unions, rivals to her own children. She feared for her lineage. And she began to whisper. It is believed that Arsinoë may have played a role in the downfall of Agathocles, Lysimachus's eldest son by another wife. Agathocles was seen as a threat. And when he was accused of treason and executed, many suspected Arsinoë's influence. If she could not fight with weapons, she would fight with strategy. But fate was not kind to her victories. In 281 BC, Lysimachus died in battle against Seleucus I, another of Alexander's successors. His empire collapsed overnight, and Arsinoë was left exposed. She fled with her sons to the city of Cassandreia, seeking protection and planning her next move. But her next marriage would lead her into darkness. Her half-brother, Ptolemy Karanos, who had seized the Macedonian throne, offered her sanctuary. Desperate to protect her sons and secure power, she married him. It was a mistake drenched in blood. Ptolemy Karanos was ambitious, cruel, and violent. Their union shocked even the twisted politics of the age. It wasn't just incestuous, it was suicidal. Shortly after their marriage, Karanos turned on Arsinoë. He murdered her 2 youngest sons, possibly in her presence, to eliminate threats to his rule. The grief Arsinoë suffered in that moment would never fully leave her. One can imagine the cold corridors of the palace echoing with the screams of a mother whose children had been stolen by their own uncle and stepfather. The 3rd son, Ptolemy of Telmessos, managed to survive, possibly hidden or spared for strategic reasons. Arsinoë fled once more. This time, she ran not only from danger, but from madness. She had been a queen, a mother, a wife, and now she was a fugitive. Twice married, twice betrayed, twice widowed by war and murder. Her hands bore the ink of diplomacy and the blood of dynasties. But she had one final move left to make. A move that would shock the ancient world. Arsinoë returned to Egypt. There, she would carve a new identity, not merely as a queen, but as a co-ruler, a goddess, and a manipulator of destiny. There, she would marry her full brother. There, she would become immortal. But the scars of her past, the betrayal, the incest, the murdered children, would shape every step of her rise. To understand Queen Arsinoë II, one must understand not just the history she inherited, but the trauma she carried. She was forged in fire. And she would soon become a flame that would burn through the annals of ancient history. The murder of her sons was more than a loss. It was a psychological fracture. Arsinoë II had watched dynasties fall and rise. She had seen ambition claim lovers, husbands, and blood relatives. But nothing compared to the horror of seeing her children, her future, strangled by power. The killer, her own husband and half-brother Ptolemy Karanos, ruled Macedonia with an iron fist and no conscience. His ruthlessness was unmatched. He had betrayed her, and he had destroyed her. Only one of her sons had survived. The eldest, Ptolemy of Telmessos, who disappeared from her immediate life, likely hidden or spirited away. Arsinoë now wandered the wreckage of her shattered world. The palaces of Lysimachus were closed to her. The throne of Macedonia was stained with her son's blood. And Egypt, once her home, her cradle, beckoned with both risk and opportunity. Returning to Egypt was not an obvious choice. Her brother, Ptolemy II Philadelphus, ruled there now. He was the son of the same father, Ptolemy I, and of the same mother, Berenice I. The same blood. Their childhoods had overlapped in the great halls of Alexandria. They had once been innocent siblings, perhaps even affectionate, though in the Ptolemaic world, no affection was without purpose. When Arsinoë arrived back in Alexandria, she came not as a broken widow, but as a strategist. She knew what she was doing. She had lost everything, and she was prepared to do the unthinkable to get it all back. Her brother Ptolemy II had already been married to Arsinoë I, daughter of Lysimachus. That marriage had political value. But something changed. Arsinoë II began to work her influence at court. How it began, whether with a whisper, a look, or a subtle threat, is lost to history. But over time, Ptolemy II began to distance himself from his wife. Rumors spread of disloyalty. Arsinoë I was soon exiled to Coptos in Upper Egypt, accused of conspiracy. The charges may have been fabricated. Many historians believe it was Arsinoë II who orchestrated the entire plot. With the former queen out of the way, Arsinoë II prepared her final play. She married her brother. In Greek tradition, this was an abomination. Siblings were not meant to wed. But the Ptolemies had long since stopped caring about Greek morality. They had adopted the sacred traditions of the pharaohs, where royal blood was preserved through incestuous union. Brother married sister. God married goddess. And now Arsinoë II stood as both queen and co-ruler of Egypt. She was no mere consort. She was an equal. Her image appeared on coins beside her brother. Statues depicted her as divine. Temples were dedicated to her name. She was worshipped alongside Aphrodite, the goddess of love, but also vengeance and desire. Yet the love she portrayed in public masked the shadows behind her throne. This marriage, her third, was not built on affection. It was built on control. Arsinoë had seized her brother's throne by manipulating the past, rewriting the future, and burying the bodies of the present. She was now queen of the greatest cultural center in the known world. Alexandria flourished with philosophy, literature, and science. The Library of Alexandria, the greatest collection of knowledge on earth, expanded under her reign. The Musaeon, a temple of the muses and home to great thinkers, prospered. But her real gift was not in letters. It was in power consolidation. She tightened her grip on Egypt's outer provinces. She managed the navy. She led foreign policy. And she cut off rivals wherever they appeared. Some ancient texts even suggest she had a say in the military affairs of the Ptolemaic Empire. No one moved without her knowledge. Her brother husband, Ptolemy II, seemed to accept this arrangement. Some say he loved her genuinely. Others say he was afraid of her. She was beautiful, commanding, and calculating. To the priests of Egypt, she was a goddess. To the court, she was untouchable. To foreign kings, she was a mystery wrapped in silks and threats. But to herself, Arsinoë may still have been a mother in mourning. There is no record of her having children by her brother. Her body, once the tool of dynastic strategy, was now a battlefield of trauma. Her murdered sons haunted her reign. Yet she never spoke of them. They had vanished. And in their place, she built monuments, alliances, and myths. She took on the title Philadelphus, sibling lover, a name meant to legitimize her rule, but one that also carried echoes of scandal. Greeks scoffed. Egyptians worshipped. And Arsinoë smiled. In her lifetime, she was depicted with the horns of Isis, the crown of Egypt, and the power of a pharaoh. She may have never worn the false beard of kingship, but her grip was firmer than most men. In her hands, Egypt held its breath. Across the sea, other rulers watched her with both admiration and fear. In Thrace, her former home, her surviving son Ptolemy of Telmessos established his own kingdom, distanced from the horror of his childhood. He would later issue coins bearing his mother's image, a quiet tribute from a son who had seen everything. But he never returned. Arsinoë's influence continued to grow. She reorganized trade routes, improved temple revenues, and strengthened Egyptian naval fleets. She was not only a royal, but a ruler in every sense. By the end of her reign, Arsinoë II was revered not only in Egypt, but also in the Aegean. Several cities named festivals in her honor. Statues of her stood in Delos, Thessos, and Athens. She had become more than a queen. She had become an icon. And yet, beneath the marble and gold, the blood of her past still stained her footsteps. Her father had given her ambition. Her husbands had given her war. Her children had been taken by betrayal. Her brother had given her a crown. But Arsinoë gave herself power. She had risen from widowhood and lost to reshape the politics of the ancient world. Her final years were spent in glory. Temples chanted her name. Coins bore her likeness. And poets compared her to goddesses. But death waited, even for a queen who had outplayed them all. In 270 BC, Arsinoë II died. How? We do not fully know. Some suggest illness. Others suggest quiet poisonings whispered in courtyards. She left no will, but her legacy was written in the history of empires. After her death, Ptolemy II deified her. She became Thea Philadelphus, the sibling goddess. Worshipped in temples. Remembered in myth. Cleansed in the waters of history, but not in the truth. Because behind the crown and the statues lay a woman who had been used, abused, betrayed, and who ultimately won. Not because she was loved, but because she refused to lose. When Arsinoë II returned to Egypt after the horrors of Macedon, she did not do so in desperation. She arrived with the cold confidence of someone who had survived both the sword and the serpent. She had buried husbands. She had buried children. And now, she was ready to bury the past beneath the golden sands of the Nile. The court in Alexandria was both familiar and foreign. Once the seat of her childhood, it had evolved into the heart of the Ptolemaic Empire, a fusion of Greek intellect, Egyptian divinity, and brutal royal politics. Her brother, Ptolemy II Philadelphus, ruled alone but uncertainly. He had inherited the throne from their father, Ptolemy I, but he lacked the martial charisma that had defined their dynasty's founder. What he possessed in intelligence, he lacked in decisiveness. And Arsinoë recognized a vacuum. One she could fill. She brought with her a painful legacy, whispers of dead sons, a scandalous second marriage, and a reputation for survival. But within that scandal lay the seeds of fear. The court knew who she was. And more importantly, what she was capable of. Ptolemy II had initially married Arsinoë I, daughter of Lysimachus, ironically, the same king who had once been Arsinoë II's first husband. The family tree of the Ptolemies was not just twisted. It was coiled like a viper. As Arsinoë II moved through Alexandria's marble corridors, she observed, waited, and then acted. Her rival, Arsinoë I, was accused of treason and exiled to Coptos. Whether the charges were real or crafted, historians debate. What is less debated is who stood to gain from Arsinoë I's fall. Within months, Arsinoë II stood at her brother's side, not merely as his advisor, but as his wife. She had returned to Egypt as a refugee. She became its queen. This was no ordinary marriage. It was a statement, a defiance of Greek custom and an embrace of Egyptian theology. Pharaohs, after all, were divine. And gods could marry their siblings. The people of Egypt accepted this union not with shame, but with awe. In their eyes, Arsinoë was Isis reborn. The goddess of motherhood, magic, and sovereignty. She was crowned again, not just as queen, but as deity. The iconography of the time reveals her transformation. She was shown with the horns of Hathor, the solar disk of divinity, and the double crown of Upper and Lower Egypt. Her face appeared on coins alongside Ptolemy II, unprecedented for a queen. This was not ornamental equality. It was political reality. Arsinoë ruled with her brother, not beneath him. Together, they expanded Egypt's influence across the eastern Mediterranean. Ptolemaic fleets secured the Aegean Sea. Trade routes extended from Cyrenaica to the Red Sea. The League of Islanders, an alliance of Aegean city-states, was brought under Egyptian control, thanks in part to the charisma and diplomacy of Arsinoë. Temples in these islands erected statues in her name. In Athens, poets and priests honored her with hymns. She had become a pan-Hellenic symbol of divine womanhood. But while her divine image spread across seas, her power within Egypt grew even more quietly, and even more dangerously. She built a network of loyalists in court. Officials, generals, temple priests, and scribes began to answer to her as much as to her brother. She coordinated religious policy, oversaw temple building projects, and even managed the redistribution of land. In Egypt's traditional society, where religion and governance were inseparable, her divine status gave her unprecedented control. The people loved her. The court feared her. Ptolemy obeyed her. And yet, beneath this calculated ascendancy lay a woman still haunted by loss. Though now crowned and deified, she never had another child. Her bloodline, the sons of Lysimachus, had been mostly destroyed. Her surviving son, Ptolemy of Telmessos, ruled a modest kingdom in Lycia, far from his mother's throne. She never brought him to Egypt. Perhaps she feared drawing attention to him. Perhaps she feared seeing his face, one that might remind her of what had been taken. Or perhaps she feared that, in Egypt, even sons could become threats. Her memory had become a weapon. She commissioned poetic epithets, songs of devotion, and civic cults. In Canopus, she was worshipped as Thea Philadelphus, the sibling goddess. In Alexandria, she was honored with processions. Festivals were renamed in her glory. And all the while, her enemies disappeared. Historians suspect that several exiled members of the court, those who had served Arsinoë I, met grim fates. Even Ptolemy II's own advisors were rotated out, their loyalty tested and their allegiance redirected. Arsinoë had learned from her past. Trust no one. Eliminate threats early. And never, ever relinquish power. Her rise was not purely political, it was psychological. She reshaped the role of queen in Egypt. No longer a passive consort, she became a commanding partner in kingship. No Ptolemaic queen before her had claimed such agency. And none would forget the standard she set. Her influence stretched beyond borders. In Syria, the Seleucid dynasty watched nervously. In Macedonia, the Antigonids regarded Egypt with caution. Because they knew that behind the throne stood a woman who had already outlived kings and crushed princes. In a time where women were often shadows behind rulers, Arsinoë was the ruler, in spirit, if not in title. And as Egypt entered one of its most stable and prosperous decades under her joint reign, she continued to build something more enduring than gold. A mythos. In temple walls, her deeds were immortalized. In marketplaces, her face adorned coinage. In the hearts of the people, she was not just a monarch, she was divine. But the divine, too, must die. Her health began to decline in the late 270s BC. Some say it was a quiet wasting illness. Others believe it was poison. The historical record remains silent on the exact cause. What is known is that she died before 270 BC. Her death was met with mourning and mythologizing. Ptolemy II, in a final act of devotion or propaganda, deified her formally. She was now not just queen, but immortal. Temples were built in her honor across Egypt and Greece. A great sanctuary at Cape Zephyrian bore her name. Even warships were named for her. Her cult became widespread, especially among elite women, who saw in her a model of regal strength. In death, Arsinoë achieved what few women in history have managed. She controlled her image. She commanded worship. And she rewrote her narrative. Not as victim, but as victor. The girl born into ambition. The bride sacrificed to politics. The mother who lost everything. The queen who took back power. And finally, the goddess who conquered history itself. Death could not silence her. When Arsinoë II drew her last breath, sometime before 270 BC, she passed not into the obscurity that claimed most queens, but into a carefully constructed afterlife of power. Because Arsinoë had not only ruled Egypt, she had redesigned how Egypt remembered. She was dead, but her image was alive. Her brother-husband, Ptolemy II Philadelphus, launched an aggressive campaign to deify her. This wasn't just mourning. It was myth-making. It was political. And it worked. Across the Egyptian world, Arsinoë became not just a name but a divine force. Temples were dedicated to her worship. Festivals were renamed in her honor. Even athletic games, modeled after the Olympics, were held in her memory. The Arsinoë, athletic and religious festivals created by Ptolemy II, served to anchor her divinity in public ritual. Every celebration, every hymn, every statue served to cement the idea: Arsinoë had not died. She had transcended. She was now a goddess. Not metaphorically, literally. She joined a growing pantheon of deified Ptolemaic rulers, but she stood above them as the most prominent woman in the dynasty. Her cult spread from Egypt into Greece and Asia Minor. She was honored in Delos, Athens, Ephesus, and Rhodes. Coins minted in her image continued to circulate, even decades after her death. She was depicted with the modius grain measure on her head, a symbol of fertility and abundance, and sometimes with the horns of Ammon, associated with god-kings. Her face was no longer just political. It was sacred. And behind this divine mask lay the memory of a woman forged by betrayal, trauma, and political calculation. Arsinoë's myth had sanitized her story. But the truth remained buried beneath the ritual. She had once been a terrified young bride sent to an elderly king. She had lost her children to her own kin. She had endured exile and manipulation. And she had responded. Not with retreat, but with ruthlessness. No one who wronged her survived. Her sister wife, Arsinoë I, vanished in exile. Her murderous husband Ptolemy Kuranos was eventually slain by Gauls, a death many in Egypt considered divine retribution. Even the memory of her enemies was scrubbed clean by her surviving legacy. Arsinoë's power lasted beyond her own life. She had fundamentally altered the role of royal women in the Hellenistic world. After her, Ptolemaic queens would no longer be passive symbols. They would be rulers. They would take on co-regency, religious authority, and political leadership. They would wear crowns not just beside their husbands, but sometimes in defiance of them. Her influence can be seen centuries later in the life of Cleopatra VII, the last and most famous queen of Egypt. Cleopatra, too, would be a goddess, a scholar, a ruler, and a consort to kings. She too would face betrayal, danger, and mythologizing. She too would trace her power back to Arsinoë II, the original queen of shadows. But where Cleopatra's end was famously tragic, Arsinoë's was eerily triumphant. She had lost everything in life. And yet in death, she had gained everything she sought. Her name was now eternal. Her image was eternal. And her enemies were dust. The cult of Arsinoë II became one of the most successful royal cults in the Hellenistic world. Worshipped as a beneficent goddess, she was seen as a protector of sailors, a bringer of fertility, and a guardian of dynasties. Shrines were built along the Nile and in port cities, where her image was often carved into temple walls beside traditional deities. Her festival days were filled with incense, processions, songs, and offerings. Priests dressed in her colors. Mothers whispered her name during childbirth. Sailors carved her symbols onto their ships. She was everywhere. But the mythology had overridden the reality. It had erased the blood. It had erased the pain. It had erased the truth of a woman who had been married to a stranger, married to a brother, married to ambition, and wedded to survival. There were whispers, of course. Some philosophers and historians outside Egypt questioned her sainthood. They remembered her hand in the fall of Agathocles. They remembered the exile of Arsinoë I. They remembered the marriage to Ptolemy Kuranos, and the children who